Greetings and welcome to the Vortex, a show where we look into and investigate exploring the mysteries of the world and beyond. I'm your host, Daniel Allen Jones, and I'm very honored to be able to introduce and welcome our next guest, who is a science professor at Harvard University, as well as the director for the Black Hole Initiative, and is the longest running chair of the Department of Astronomy there, as well as the director for the theory and computation there at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Many more accolades, as well as not only that, has written hundreds of papers, as well as multiple books authored, including Extraterrestrial, very good one, which we'll be getting into here in just a moment, as well as the head of the Galileo Project. It's an honor to be able to welcome you to the Vortex. Dr. Avi Loeb, it's an honor to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure.
So you've been involved with some interesting work, and I'm glad to be able to see that it's gotten a lot of notoriety, and many people have probably seen you in media and on the mainstream news as well, talking about the object which you write about here in Extraterrestrial, Oumuamua. And it gets a lot of attention. I think it's something that people are curious about. There's a lot of interest in this. There's the pop culture issue that I think people are looking at in a way that makes them wonder, is there life out there? And you've done an immense job of looking at this scientifically and from the academic perspective, and some other ways that kind of connect with where the government is going and they're investigating as well. And so before we get into the main focus of our time for today, which I'd like to look at Galileo Project's work at these three focuses that you describe, I'd like to maybe allow you to preface some of this with your involvement with Oumuamua and how you've gone from discovery to declaration. And then now, as we've seen over the years, it's become a very hot topic and it's something that people are really interested in. Share with us, if you don't mind, a little bit about how this has kind of led to the social notoriety that it is now.
Well, only over the past decade, we were able to detect objects from outside the solar system with telescopes. And the first report about such an object was from Pan-STARRS in Hawaii, which was aiming to find near-Earth objects. That was the task. And then it found one that was moving too fast to be bound to the sun, roughly the size of a football field. And it was discovered on October 19, 2017. And at first, we all thought that it may be a rock from another star, similar to the rocks in the solar system, but it had properties that made it very unusual. Anomalous. For example, it had a very extreme shape, most likely flat, and as it was tumbling, the amount of sunlight reflected from it changed by a factor of 10. So it meant that it's very extreme in its shape. As it's tumbling, the long axis must be at least 10 times longer than the short axis projected on the sky. And then it was pushed away from the sun by some non-gravitational force, and it wasn't clear what was it, because there was no evaporation of the object. There wasn't any rocket effect. And it had some other anomalies. It came from a very special frame of reference that only 1 in 500 stars comes from, and it's the frame that you get to when you average the random motions of the stars in the vicinity of the sun. And so it was very unusual, and since the discovery, astronomers tried to explain it as a natural object, but all the proposals involved an object of a type that we've never seen before, like a hydrogen iceberg, a nitrogen iceberg, a dust bunny that is 100 times less dense than air, or most recently, a water iceberg turned into a hydrogen iceberg. And all of these proposals involve objects that we've never seen before, but moreover, they face major challenges. And I pointed them out in different papers. And so that makes this object weird. And it's the first one we noticed from outside the solar system. And the question is whether it was artificial in origin. I suggested that it was very thin. For example, it could be a piece of a Dyson sphere, a megastructure that another civilization built around the star to collect all of its light. And then the easiest way to do that is to put very thin membranes that are hovering above the star and are pushed away by the starlight that balances the pull by gravity from the star. So they just like kites, they hover above the star, and then they collect its light. And then when the star brightens up, late in its evolution, it can break up this megastructure that Freeman Dyson envisioned about 60 years ago. It's called Dyson sphere. And what you will end up with are pieces of the Dyson sphere flying through interstellar space, and they would be very thin. So that could be one origin that I wrote about recently, but it could also be a layer, an outer layer of a bigger object. And I should say that 3 years later, there was another object discovered by the same telescope that was pushed away from the sun by reflecting sunlight without a cometary tail. It was given the name 2020 SO, and it ended up being a rocket booster that NASA launched in 1966. And it indeed was very thin. It was made of stainless steel, and therefore it didn't have any cometary tail, but it showed a push away from the sun by reflecting sunlight. So we know that this one was artificial because we made it. The question is, who made Oumuamua? And that remains an open question because we can't collect more data about it, but we can look for more objects of the same type. And the way I call it is dating the next Oumuamua. And we have a dating app, which is the Vera Rubin Observatory that will start operations in Chile by the end of this year. And it will have a 3.2 billion pixel camera that surveys the southern sky every 4 days. And it's likely to find more objects like Oumuamua. And together with my students and postdocs, we're planning to find those objects and also look at them with the Webb telescope that gives us an opportunity to detect the heat emitted by these objects and monitor their motion in 3 dimensions, because we'll have observatories from Earth and the Webb telescope a million miles away. Looking at the object, we can pinpoint the trajectory in 3 dimensions and figure out any propulsion that it may have. So that's why Oumuamua is really important. It's the first reported interstellar object. But since then, together with my student, we discovered another object that was actually detected in 2014, about 4 years before Oumuamua, much smaller in size, the size of a big watermelon. And it collided with Earth. It was a meteor from an interstellar origin. And it was unusual as well because it exploded only in the lower atmosphere of the Earth. And from that, we inferred that it was made of a material that is tougher than all other 272 meteors in the catalog that NASA compiled over the past decade. So the question is whether it was a spacecraft, because if you imagine Voyager, for example, that we launched to interstellar space, 1 billion years from now, it will not be functional. It will be just like a piece of junk floating through space. And it could collide with a planet somewhere, and it would then appear as a meteor. And so we want to visit the explosion site over the Pacific Ocean in the summer of 2023, very soon, and find any fragments left over from this meteor and then examine their composition. And that would be very exciting. It's the first time that humans put their hands on material from a big object that came from outside the solar system.
It's incredible. And I think that it's a very diverse array of work to try to look into all of these different issues. And you're hitting upon some of these focuses that I think the Galileo Project is doing an amazing job really focusing in on. You mentioned the underwater potential of these underwater objects that are from extraterrestrial origin that have landed here at some point and that might contain some interesting clues as to not only if they are natural, if they are artificial, but if they are produced, if they're manufactured from somewhere else. And I think that's a really fascinating concept. And kind of moving into these areas, what are these focuses that you've described in some ways, the 3 focuses of the Galileo Project that deal with the underwater search, as well as the search for deep space? And then there's another component as well. Would you mind sharing a little bit about these 3 focuses for the Galileo Project?
Right. With respect to the search in the Pacific Ocean, I should say that I asked my class just a couple of weeks ago, the last class before the summer, I asked them, what would you do if you encounter an extraterrestrial gadget and it had buttons on it? Would you press a button? And half of the class said no, they are really worried about the consequences. And I asked them, what do you mean, to yourself or humanity? And they said both. And the second half of the class said no, they would be really curious to find out what happens if you press the button. It's sort of like finding a GPT 100 and trying to see what it does, or iPhone 100. So then a student in the class asked me, what would you do, Professor Loeb? And I said that I would bring it to a laboratory first, just like as if I captured an intelligent creature, that suffered some traumatic experience, and you first want to figure out what, before you engage with its body, what is going on here and what it's made of. And so I would be more careful before pressing any button. And that's with respect to going after interstellar meteors that may represent technological relics. So that's indeed one of the branches of the Galileo Project, and we're planning to follow on it this summer. But the second is, I mentioned it already, the finding the next Oumuamua, dating the next Oumuamua, and learning more about it with now the perspective that we have, that we realize that Oumuamua was very anomalous, and we want to find more about objects like it. And then the third one has to do with unidentified aerial phenomena that the US government talks about. The Director of National Intelligence delivered 2 reports to Congress over the past couple of years, where military personnel report about the incidents where they noticed objects whose nature is unclear. And it could be that half of them are balloons, and indeed the US government shut down 4 such objects recently. But the question is whether there is any one object that may be of extraterrestrial origin. And anything to do with human-made objects is boring for me. It's, of course, of great interest to the intelligence agencies, to the Department of Defense, because they are concerned with national security. But anything that says made in China, as far as I'm concerned, is very boring. I would like to know whether there is anything that says made on exoplanet Y, it's possible that we might come across such a thing. So we built a new observatory that is already operating at Harvard University, and monitoring the entire sky in the infrared, optical, radio, and audio. And we're now analyzing the data with machine learning and artificial intelligence software, and trying to separate natural objects from human-made objects like drones, balloons, airplanes, and see if there is anything else in the data stream. So that's the first observatory already operating, and we're planning to make copies of it and put them in other locations. And the number of copies we make will depend on how much funding we get. So at the moment, we can afford maybe a few of those, but my hope is that we will get donations that would allow us to have tens of those. And at that point, we will get to the bottom of this puzzle of what unidentified aerial phenomena are all about, because we'll collect hundreds of data sets from different locations that would allow us to have enough statistics. And even if there is one unusual object per 100 or per 1,000, we should be able to tell at that point. So that would cost tens of millions of dollars, which is not a lot for a scientific project. And I hope that in the coming year, we'll be able to secure that funding.
Well, I hope so. It would be very interesting to see what is able to be determined with some of these observatories being functional. And it's very interesting to see the range that you're covering, as you mentioned, with these different studies. When it comes to UFO history and the many legends within the mythos of ufology, there are stories of contact with non-human intelligences. There are stories of crashed UFOs or objects, even bodies recovered, and things like abductions and all of these issues pertaining to some kind of what people interpret as non-human entities. What is your take on the validity? Do you find any credence within these stories? Is there anything that has stood out to you, or is Galileo Project considering any of these in any serious scientific scrutiny?
So our approach is different than anyone in the past. We are not looking at reports from the past, especially not at eyewitness testimonies, because this is not scientific quality data where you can analyze it. It's not quantitative. It's often people telling stories. And although we are intrigued by this, but the point also about past reports, I mean, there are people that suggested going back 100 years and looking at photographic plates. And of course, there is a new office in government, AARO, all anomaly domain resolution, and it focuses at this point on analyzing reports from the past. But the problem with that is the data is limited. So if the data was collected anecdotically without having any systematic survey, just by chance someone unexpectedly saw something that was not accounted for, you can't do much with it if the quality of the data is not great. You cannot figure out something that is not obvious from the data. And so if the data is compromised, if it's not of the highest quality, you can't really figure it out. It doesn't matter how many people look at it. It's still fuzzy, blurry, not clear. And the same is true about cell phone images or anecdotal reports. And the point of the Galileo project is, instead of relying on other people that by chance saw something unusual, we will collect our own data in a systematic fashion where we have full control over the instruments. We calibrate the instruments, we understand how they operate, we use artificial intelligence to analyze the data and learn from experience. So it will not be analyzed by humans who have biases. It will not be based on the memory or reports of humans, because if you think about, for example, the Soccer World Cup in Qatar, FIFA decided to rely on an automated system in deciding on offsides. And why is that? Because if you were to ask the players, they would claim different things depending on which side they're on. And obviously the audience will not be reliable. So you want to rely on cameras looking at the field. And if FIFA can do it, we should do it with respect to UAP, to unidentified aerial phenomena as well, because that's the way we will get to the bottom of what they mean. And so instead of obsessing with the past, pushing the government to declassify things or to release or disclose past reports, instead of doing that, I think a much healthier approach is to collect our own data, because the sky is not classified. If there is anything unusual out there and we will collect the data, we will see it. And within a few years, we should have orders of magnitude more data than ever reported in all of the reports throughout history. Just the Galileo project. We are already collecting for a few months a huge amount of data, much more than all the photographs that were released. So my point is, and this is from one location, we want to do it over tens of locations with many observatories. And that is the way by which we will get some certainty into the conversation, some statistical sense. Instead of a pilot reporting seeing something unusual once a decade, a commercial pilot, we will be able to survey the sky in enough locations to say, if we see something unusual, what is the rate by which such things appear? What are their properties? If we see them, we can look at them with better instruments. So when you see something in real time, you can respond to it and get even better data about it, rather than relying on the past, especially when it's just eyewitness testimonies you can't do much with.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of focus on some of these stories in a way that leads to sensationalism. It seems like it's a very refreshing approach to stay level-headed, and as you say, just make sure to stick with the data that you can accumulate through your own work. And there are many different attempts at trying to verify and validify many of these stories. But I think that as you say, it shows that the historical approach with AARO, as you mentioned, the Alderney Anomaly Resolution Office with Sean Kirkpatrick, is something that a lot of people have caught an attention with, because you have co-authored a paper regarding the notion that it's possible that some objects may be utilizing some mode or form of artificial intelligence to go out and find what they can, possibly here on Earth as well. And so when you see the cooperation between your involvement and someone with the caliber of Kirkpatrick or Arrow, this program, it makes for a very interesting pairing. Do you find that if they continue to have a decent working relationship with you and others, that you might be willing to work with them on, in the event that someone were to come forward? Let's say with all of these different stories out there about crash retrievals, there's the idea that Admiral Wilson met with Dr. Eric Davis and spoke about these programs, these special access programs that deal with crash retrievals of unknown origin. If it were to be that someone came forward and said, at least some of this is real, would you find that you might be in a position to help substantiate, corroborate, or work toward progressing that area of involvement with the government once again?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the point is, anything that is of scientific value, that has nothing to do with national security because it's not human-made, should be open to the public. That is knowledge that should be shared by everyone. I don't see any conflict between national security concerns and scientific research on this subject, because they're complementary. If there is something extraterrestrial, it has nothing to do with national borders. I haven't seen clear evidence of past data showing that. That's why I want to collect my own data rather than pressing the government to release whatever incomplete data or partial data they might have. But if they do have something, I hope they will share it openly so I can look into it. I don't want to sign any NDA because that would limit my ability to act freely as a scientist. And then suppose the Galileo Project sees something, by looking at the sky, my hands will be tied by whatever commitment I have, because I can always be blamed for releasing information that I learned from classified documentation. So in that sense, it's much better to do it in the scientific way, where we analyze the data that is open to everyone. And in particular, if that data is not provided by the government, so be it. Let's collect our own data. Why do we need to press them to do something they don't want to do for national security reasons? They don't want to reveal the quality of the sensors that they're using right now, so they will not release the data. It's not so much about the data, but about the instruments used to collect them. But the Galileo Project, we bought off-the-shelf instruments. We built it ourselves. Just like astronomers, we look at the sky and analyze what we see. And so in that sense, it's a new way of looking at it. If you consider all the organizations that talk about UAP, including the government one, but also civilian ones, they always talk about past reports and ask people for their opinion and analyze these blurry images, none of which looks convincing so far, beyond any reasonable doubt. So I think that's the wrong approach, because we can argue about it forever. We can press the government forever and without getting anything out of it. And it will be just a waste of our time. It's much better to just collect our own data with instrumentation that we fully understand, without relying on chance circumstances where, a commercial pilot happened to fly above Spain and saw some weird object. So, I mean, what can we do with that? I saw such a photograph last week from such a pilot, and it's just one image that looks that shows an object. But what can you do? You can't figure out how the object was moving. You can't figure out anything about its distance. So this is not the way to understand, to get to the bottom of UAP. The way to do it is collect your own data, do triangulation with multiple instruments, and do it in a professional way. And I'm just surprised that this was not done until now. Decades people talk about it, keep pushing the government to do things. But, of course, it's very easy to have an opinion, to be a believer in one thing or another. But it's hard work to collect the data yourself. But just like JFK said, he talked about going to the moon, but here we say, we do this work not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And we just want to figure it out by collecting the data ourselves, and everyone will know about it. It will be open, not secretive. It will not be based on beliefs. It will be based on what we see. And that's the way a kid approaches any puzzle. A kid tries to figure it out by looking at the evidence. Adults invent all these stories. So I think it's about time that we become more mature, like the kids are, and try to figure it out without inventing stories, pretending that we know something we don't really know.
Right. I think that's an excellent approach. It's something that helps to keep it grounded and sobering, because there's still so much that's fascinating for us to understand. And shifting gears a little bit, and speaking of attempts to look into the frontiers of science and how new disciplines may emerge, you write about it in your book here, Extraterrestrial. You have a section on astroarchaeology, and I think that with the attempts to detect some of the signatures, structures, any of these potentially manufactured objects or constructs deep within space or perhaps nearby, it allows for us to consider, and in some of your theoretical work, what the possibilities are for the future academics, and how we might look at this anthropologically, biologically, and where that might take us. What are your thoughts on the new emerging disciplines in the scientific frontier when it comes to this study, and what it might allow for young and curious minds in new generations to come?
Well, first of all, this could be the most important discovery that humanity makes, that we might not be alone, and it will imply that we can learn from them, from whatever partner we find out there. And as a result, there will be a lot of possible research avenues that will involve, for example, how do we communicate with a foreign culture, with an alien culture? How do we import their technologies to Earth? What kind of new science do we learn from them? How do we change our aspirations for space, given the fact that they reached us while we didn't reach them yet? We better recalculate and figure out how to get to them or other civilizations, because there may be many more. So altogether, I think it will give a new meaning to our cosmic existence. And it's sort of like finding a partner in life. It changes the meaning of your existence. And I think it will be extremely important. And there will be new branches of academic research dedicated to each of these aspects of what I call cosmic archaeology. So there would be the technology aspect, the communication aspect, the philosophical implications of what to do with it, and the history, that extends well beyond the history of humanity. We might learn what happened a long time ago in our vicinity, in our cosmic neighborhood. And I talk about a lot of these implications in my next book that is coming out at the end of August 2023, this year, just a few months from now. And I actually have a preliminary copy of it next to me. It's called the Interstellar, and it's discussing exactly the extended answer to your question.
Awesome. So I think it's going to be something everyone's going to be looking forward to. It's been an amazing time to see how a lot of this has come out of the fringes of science fiction and through pop culture into reality for many people in society who are looking to explore this topic and understand more. As a send-off, what would you say for people who are interested in learning more, finding out more about your work and how to get involved? There are many events coming up. You're also going to be speaking at Contact in the Desert here in a few weeks. What would you say about how events like this and the ways that we generate awareness in this topic help to encourage and promote a better standard of awareness when it comes to these issues?
Well, I think science can be exciting. It doesn't need to be boring. It doesn't need to represent the past knowledge the way that many experts prefer it to be, because their stature relies on past knowledge. It could be exciting because it may represent new knowledge. And the universe so far, appeared to be lifeless, but that's because we didn't search well enough. And I argue we should check for any packages in our mailbox or in our backyard that could have been sent from a neighbor. even if the neighbor is not alive anymore and cannot transmit any radio signals. We were looking for radio signals for 70 years. We haven't found them. So it's a new approach, and I hope that the next generation of scientists will be engaged and will find the answers to the question of not only are we alone, but are we the smartest kid in our cosmic neighborhood, or what can we learn from the others? And I think it's completely arrogant for us to imagine us being the smartest who ever existed since the Big Bang. So I do think this is a new frontier that will become more and more prominent in shaping our future. And we're just at the beginning of it, because we discovered these first interstellar objects and they look unusual. And I think the more evidence we get on objects like them, the more clear it will become that maybe something unusual is happening outside the solar system. And, we've already noticed that 90 years ago, Fritz Zwicky, an astronomer, discovered that most of the matter in the universe is of a substance that is different from what we find in the solar system. It's called dark matter. Still, we don't know what it is, but we are made of a residual form of matter, the ordinary matter that we see in the solar system. And so if most of the matter in the universe is of a substance that we have never witnessed in the solar system, it could well be that most of the objects that enter the solar system from outside, these are interstellar objects, they represent an origin that is very different from the rocks that we are used to in the solar system. So that's all I'm saying. And we just need to collect more data. And the young people, the good news is we have the scientific instrumentation that can allow us to do that. So instead of relying on legends, stories from the past, if you just imagine Moses, there is this story in the Old Testament that Moses noticed a burning bush, okay? And that was a miracle that was supposed to convince Moses to believe in God or whatever. And if, Moses had the help of the Galileo Project back then, we could have put an assembly of infrared sensors near the burning, or at a distance from the burning bush, measure the surface temperature of the burning bush and triangulate its distance and figure out how much power it emits, and basically infer whether indeed it's a natural object like a real bush that is burning and unusually, or something else. And what I'm saying is, instead of a belief that it represents a miracle, you can actually substantiate it with science. And a very advanced scientific civilization could be an approximation to God in a way, because it would produce technologies that we cannot imagine, that can do things that we can't imagine. Because just think of our current technologies, like a cell phone showing up near the cave of a cave dweller from thousands of years ago, like, 10,000 years ago. And the cave dweller will argue it's a rock of a type that I've never seen before.
It sounds like something that, as you mentioned, appears in many different archetypes throughout history as these legends. And I think it's something that will, be deep-seated within humanity and in our legacy for times to see how we make sense of these stories. But it's something that, as you mentioned, applying a scientific outlook can help us sort of straighten out the facts, give us real raw data that we can use to make determinations now. And in conclusion, do you find that there's an effort likened to the space race for the first declaration to be made about extraterrestrial intelligence? Do you think that maybe the Galileo Project, or perhaps the government through Aero or any other department, or even NASA's SETI or any of these other space agencies, have any incentive to be the first ones to make this declaration of the discovery of extraterrestrial intelligence or anything similar to this?
Well, no, I think it's the other way around. I would argue that too few people are engaged in this. And if you look at the number of physicists working on the search for dark matter, there are thousands of them, and we haven't found it for decades. And very few are engaged in the search for objects that came from extraterrestrial technological civilizations. In fact, the Galileo Project is the first scientific project aiming to get new data that is reproducible and not anecdotal in a systematic way. And so I would much rather have more people involved, because it's not about the messenger. It's not so much who delivers the message. It's actually the content of the message that matters here for humanity. And I think it would be nice if more groups, in addition to the Galileo Project, get involved. But as of now, instead of waiting for others to do the right thing, I'm just doing the right thing. I'm trying to do my best. And it's quite possible that we will find something exciting in the Pacific Ocean when I go there, or that the Galileo Project observatory analyzing the data with machine learning algorithms will uncover some objects that behave in very strange ways. Or there will be another object like Oumuamua that we identify and monitor, and it looks really like an artificial object. So it's all possible, and instead of relying on other people to do the right thing, I'm trying to do my best to pursue these goals, because there aren't many takers. I mean, a lot of people have an opinion on this, but this is not politics. Science is better than politics, because we can learn from data, from evidence. We can collect the data. Of course, it's more effort than sitting on your sofa, on your couch, and having an opinion. But this is work that needs to be done in order to get a better understanding of reality, of the cosmic neighborhood that we live in. And surprisingly, for decades, people were just expressing opinions, looking at past data that was incomplete, always blurry, partial, unclear, and just talking about it forever. And I say, we can do better than that.
I think so. And it's amazing to see how we can continue to work together to produce these results. And so for anyone interested, how can they follow up with your work and your upcoming book? Where can they go to find out more?
Right. So I put continuous updates on medium.com. I have an essay there almost every couple of days. So just put Avi Loeb at medium.com, and you can subscribe to it for free. And I will keep a diary there as soon as we go to the Pacific Ocean, where I basically give daily updates about what happens. So just if you want to follow on a regular basis, just subscribe. It doesn't cost anything, for free. And then, of course, my book is coming out at the end of August, Interstellar. It will have some additional content in it. And finally, if you are interested in pursuing science, there is a way of volunteering to the Galileo Project. Also, if you just have the money to support the project without the technical expertise, that would help us pursue it. And again, there is a website, the Galileo Project website at Harvard University, where there is a button saying support us. And if you click on that, you will find how to do it. So altogether, I think as a team, we can figure out the answer. We don't need to rely on the government telling us. The government is not a scientific organization. And the whole beauty of science is that it will be open data that can be shared by everyone. Within a week, we will share the first batch of scientific papers that the Galileo Project produced, about 9 of them. It will be publicly available, and anyone can look at them. And then now we are writing the next batch of papers that will include some results from our observatory. So stay tuned, and you will get those updates.
Awesome. Well, we're definitely looking forward to the new book and your appearance at Contact in the Desert, as well as other events to come. Hope your expedition and all your endeavors bode well. It's something that I think really will help change how we're exploring this topic and all the things to come from it. We are making new discoveries every day. I like to think that we won't know if we don't go, and you're doing just that. So, Dr. Loeb, I want to appreciate and thank you for your time today, and we'll see you in the Vortex.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you.